Hey, City Life, welcome to Holy Week. I'm excited about these devotions that Pastor Justin and I are putting together for you. They're going to drop at noon every day, Monday through Friday this week of Holy Week, leading up to Easter weekend. You can find them right here on our YouTube channel, The City Life Church. And so let's just jump in. Our verses for today are going to come out of Matthew 21. I'm going to start reading in verse 18. It says, "In the morning, as Jesus was returning to Jerusalem, he was hungry, and he noticed a fig tree beside the road. He went over to see if there were any figs, but there were only leaves. And then he said to it, 'May you never bear fruit again.'" He actually curses the fig tree. Then he said, "May you never bear fruit again." These are harsh words. And immediately, it says, the fig tree withered up. The disciples were amazed when they saw this and asked, "How did the fig tree wither so quickly?" Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm reading verses like this, it reminds me of the self-control that Jesus had, because here, during his earthly ministry, let's not forget that he brought with him the knowledge of every advancement that mankind would discover until the end of time. And yet when he was here, unless it served his ministry, unless it was revealing something about the kingdom of God, he never revealed something that was going to happen in the future. Now, I'm just saying, and maybe it's because I haven't had lunch yet today, that this reminds me that in this moment, I'm just saying he could have made an exception. He could have made an exception, and he could have revealed to the world the recipe for the fig Newton, but alas, he did not. So why does he curse this fig tree? Is he angry because he's hungry? No, we know that's not the case because of the character of Christ. He was someone who was without sin. So why does he curse this fig tree? Because when we look at the fig tree, when we look at how the fig tree grows, when we look at the seasons by which the fig tree bears fruit, what we see here is that during the time of year of Jesus' death and resurrection, that fig trees aren't supposed to bear fruit. In fact, Jesus found this fig tree exactly how he should have found it in the season that it was in. It had leaves, and that's all that it should have had. In fact, if this fig tree had a consciousness, it would have said, "Jesus, look at all these other fig trees. None of them have fruit because it's not yet the time for fruit." Jesus is teaching us something about life as a devoted follower of Christ. He curses this tree because he's trying to help us understand what it means to be a devoted follower of Christ, that he expects to find fruit in our lives. He expects us to be someone that is different from the rest of the world. He expects us to live our lives in such a way where we go beyond what we're capable of in just relying on our human nature. He's trying to help us to understand that when we are a devoted follower of Christ, there should be fruit in our lives that might not be found in the rest of the world. I believe what Jesus is teaching us here through this fig tree is about false permission. False permission is when we give consent to ourselves to be less than what Jesus expects of us. False permission is when we give consent to ourselves to be less than what Jesus expects of us. Now, let me give you 3 examples of where we see false permission taking place, or at least the opportunity for false permission. The first one Jesus overcame because he's Jesus, but he gave his example to us so that we ourselves could overcome. The second 2, however, succumbed to the temptation. Now, the first one is Satan tempted Jesus at the end of his 40 days in the wilderness because our humanity is vulnerable to false permission when we are emotionally and physically exhausted. It's instructive of when the devil came to tempt Jesus. The Bible tells us that Jesus was so exhausted at the end of his encounter, at the end of his experience of being in the wilderness for 40 days, that angels literally came and had to minister to him. This is when Satan came to tempt him. Because why? He was emotionally and physically exhausted. Now, we know that he withstood the temptation, but our next 2 examples are not examples of what to do, but examples of what not to do. Satan tempted Judas after Jesus began telling the disciples that he would die because our humanity is vulnerable to false permission when our expectations are taken from us. Now, if Judas were here, I think in defense of himself, he would say, I know you see me as the betrayer, but I want you to understand my mindset in the moment. I saw Jesus as the betrayer because every Jewish person believed that the Messiah was going to establish an earthly kingdom and would become a king, a political king. Israel would rise to dominance in the world, and those who were with the king, especially those closest with him, like the disciples, that they would be his court of sorts, and they would be entitled to all kinds of wealth and power and prestige. And when Judas realizes this is not Jesus' plan, his expectations are taken from him, he enters into a place of false permission and gives himself permission to do something that he otherwise should not have done. Satan tempted Peter after Jesus' arrest because our humanity is vulnerable to false permission when we feel completely overwhelmed by our present crisis. Now, when we take our situation with this global pandemic and we look at it in the light of this teaching, I think what we can all say to ourselves honestly, that there have been times over these last several weeks where we have been emotionally and physically exhausted. There have been times over these last couple of weeks where our expectations have been taken from us. I mean, think about stories that we have read about where people have loved ones who have died and they've not been able to say goodbye. They've not been able to be with them. They've not been able to even have a funeral. Think about people that we know right here in the City Life Church who have dreamed their whole life of the wedding that they've always wanted, but yet that expectation was taken from them. All of us at times have felt overwhelmed by this present crisis. These leave us feeling vulnerable to false permission. False permission can reveal itself in many ways. The temptation can come to us in many ways. For some of us, we're going to be tempted to be less patient with other people. For some of us, we're going to be tempted to not walk in the fruitfulness of the character of Christ, and we're going to use the fact that we're emotionally, physically exhausted. We're going to use the fact that our expectations have been taken from us. We're going to use the fact that we're overwhelmed by this present crisis as a sense of permission to not treat other people with the character of Christ. People that are in recovery, be careful. False permission is knocking at the door for you. Alcohol, pornography, prescription drugs, whatever it is that you've been using to self-medicate, do not let this season that you're in, the emotional despair that you're feeling as a moment of vulnerability to false permission to give yourself consent to do things that you know that you shouldn't. Any thought or feeling, listen to me, that begins with this idea, I deserve this, be careful. Any thought or feeling that begins to well up in your heart that with a sense of I'm entitled to this because, be careful. 1 Corinthians 10:13 reads this way. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure it. Father, I pray for every person right now that's watching this devotion here on Monday, the first day of Holy Week. And I pray for all of us. Find us to be the kind of fig tree that bears fruit even when it's not the right season. Help us to be patient out of season. Help us to have self-control out of season. Help us to be gracious and merciful out of season. Help us to be faith-filled out of season. May it be that the character of Christ would abound in us, even when it seems to be absent in the rest of the world. In Christ's name, come on, and everybody said together, amen. We'll see you tomorrow.